Welcome back, everyone. This is Angel Miller with Phalanx, and that's phalx.com. This week we're going to be speaking with Richard Rudgley. He's the author of The Return of Odin, which looks at the influence of the deity and of the pagan tradition in the modern world today. It has to be said that the sound quality is probably not the best that I've recorded, but I fixed the issues. It is definitely listenable, but it will be a little cleaner in future. Richard Rudgley, thank you for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having me. I'm a big fan of Phalanx, so it's nice to be here.
Oh, good to hear. Excellent. So you're the author of the recently released book, The Return of Odin, which we'll get into momentarily. But perhaps you could just tell us a little bit about your background and how you became interested in Odinism and magic and paganism and so on and so forth.
I became interested in occultism and Oriental religions and things like that in my late teens and early 20s. I went back to university because I dropped out originally. So I went to London SOAS and I studied, history of religions and anthropology. And then postgraduate, I went to Oxford and studied prehistory and anthropology there. So I had a very Catholic interest in other people's religions and roots, and probably knew more about, some fairly obscure religious and spiritual movements than I did, my own cultural heritage. So, I was very slow to pick up on the fact that, all roads lead to home. And, eventually I got interested in the European pre-Christian traditions. So that's how I kind of came to, what I tend to call the Northern tradition, which, as you say, is often called Odinism or many other names, heathenry and so forth.
Right. So how long ago was it that you became interested in Odinism?
Well, I see it as part of a sort of wider thing. And looking back, I think things like, I was very interested in Tolkien as a child, and then as a adolescent in heavy metal and German ambient music and things like that. And now looking back, I see those as all part of that broader cultural backdrop. So in a sense, it's always been there, but it was really probably only about 20 years ago that I sort of started being more focused on it and more aware of its spiritual and cultural components, I suppose.
Okay, so maybe you could just explain a little bit about the book, how it came about, and its sort of general thrust. I published, I think, 5 books before it originally came out under the title Pagan Resurrection in 2006. It was a kind of departure for me because up to then my books had taken a fairly conventional historical tack, and I wrote about the early history and cultural history of various things. But with this one, it was more personal, and it's not a straightforward historical book. It's about Odin, but it's not really a historical study of Odin through the ages and how he was perceived as a god and this kind of thing. It's more really, the springboard is Jung's comments on Odin. He talks about him as Wotan, as the German version, Odin being the Scandinavian one, and Woden being the English one. But it's essentially the same god. And Jung started writing about it in 1936. He wrote an essay about it in relation to National Socialism and other matters as well. And really some of the things he said about Odin as an archetype, as I'm sure and many of your listeners will, Jung, was very interested in archetypes and the influence they had on individuals and society at large. And he felt that Odin was really a deeper, maybe more unconscious but more powerful influence on Germanic peoples than Christ, and so really that's the sort of springboard for the book.
Right, and I did notice in the blurb that it says that that you claim that Odin has been more influential in the West than Christ, which is a pretty controversial thing to say. So maybe you could just go into that a little bit.
Well, I think it's possible to, I mean, he's generally sort of related to the Viking Age, but I think the roots go back much further, and I think there's a certain amount of continuity in the pre-Christian tradition. So it's very old in that sense.
Yeah.
Christianity may have been around, depending on where you're talking about, from 1500 to 1,000 years ago. Most places were converted. Iceland, obviously, later than England, but
right.
That's really a drop in time if you look at the sort of deeper prehistoric roots, of the pre-Christian tradition. So. Also, I think there's a lot of elements of European Christianity that weren't there before, in Christianity, that is, before Christianity came to Europe. In other words, there's, as you can certainly see, it's perhaps a little clearer in the history of Buddhism. You can see, for example, Zen Buddhism is a mixture of Buddhism and Taoist traditions and so forth. So I think when one incoming religion enters a part of the world, it tends to syncretize in some respects with what's already there, and I certainly think you can see that with Northern European Christianity. So I think there's a continuity there, even in the Christian era. So it's not like he was gone and completely forgotten. I think the impulse is, very deep. And continued throughout Christianity in one form or another.
So you believe that Odin is essentially maybe appears before Odin as we understand him is a sort of older and deeper archetype. Is that right? Or
yes, in some respects. I mean, certainly around obviously before the Viking Age,
right? And
I think he has deeper roots, maybe obviously not necessarily under the same name, but I do think he's a very complex. I mean, there's many gods in the history of religions, they're quite complicated, but he is extremely complicated and intriguing character. As I mentioned in the book, we know about 200 names he was given. So that's more names than Aleister Crowley gave himself, I think, possibly.
Yeah, almost, yeah.
And some of them are very interesting. For example, one of them is he's called the True One, and another one is he's called the Deceiver.
Right.
So that's what I mean. And I think this is quite interesting in regard to Jung, is because Jung had this idea that your shadow self needs to be incorporated in your more acceptable side in order for the process of individuation to take place. And certainly Odin's got plenty of darkness as well as, more acceptable side. So he's a very complicated character, but his name, the actual name Odin, means frenzy.
Right.
And as I mentioned in the book, I think that he, in a sense, he represents altered states, however they're achieved. Excuse me. Yes, they represent altered states of various kinds. For example, the berserker were the kind of special forces, I suppose, of the Viking world. They tend to go into these sort of trances, which was one type of altered state, and I think drink or drug intoxication be another example. Poetry, which again he's a god of poetry, is very important.
Yeah,
part of his personality, and he has quite a few sexual adventures. So I think it's to see, is another example of his frenzy. So it can manifest in different ways, and through him it tends to manifest in all of them.
Right. So in a sense, he's a kind of shamanic figure, I guess.
Yes, in some ways, I think he is. I mean, shamanism is it can mean almost anything to anyone these days, but there's definitely some correlations there. I mean, the central part of his myth is that he hung on the world tree for 9 nights without food or water, and at the end of it, he had a revelation of runes being the sort of mysteries of the universe. So, I mean, it's quite easy to see that as a at least quasi-shamanic ordeal. And of course, people have made comparisons with the crucifixion, although I think there's some vital differences. I mean, one of them is he says he sacrificed himself to himself. So I think there's certainly a Gnostic core to that, in the sense that he's, mastering his lower self and giving up, sacrificing that to his higher self. So it's certainly an initiation myth for sure.
So Odin is, obviously an ancient archetype in the West. But so how is Odin influencing us today? Would you say?
Well, I think what we can see is a resurgence of paganism in general, of which this is one type. But I really think Jung's quite a key character in this, not just in terms of his ideas, but about Odin, but in general terms. I mean, it's interesting. There's a commentator called Richard Rudgley who's written 2 books about Jung. Kind of exposing him as a pseudoscientist with.
Is this the Aryan Christ guy?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
You've read. Yeah, so you know these, and he's sort of revealing him as an occultist, couching his ideas in a pseudoscientific language of psychology, psychoanalysis, and so on. And really, he was a pagan. In fact, Noel says something very interesting. He says he thinks that Jung succeeded in terms of bringing back paganism where Julian the apostate was unable to do in the 4th century. And so for Noel, that's an exposure of Jung, as but to me, it's actually quite the opposite. It's, I don't blame Jung for that. I think that's actually really good. So, I do think, a lot of people, again, Jung, that is, thinks that Nietzsche's unknown God, as is mentioned, was also Odin.
Really?
Of course, we know that Nietzsche himself couched his sort of pagan views in terms of the classical world, which was, fairly normal at that time. So Jung considers him unaware of the fact that really he was drawing on those Germanic roots.
Right. So what are some of the historical movements that have been influenced by Odin? Because they seem to be, from the description of your book, sort of quite contradictory movements in a way.
Yes, I think that's a fair statement. We can refer back to when I was talking about the various names of Odin. Some of them are direct contradictions to others. And I think his manifestations have been equally wide and in some cases contradictory. I mean, I think it's possible, as Jung does, to see the National Socialist movement as having some elements of that, though I think that's been grossly distorted and sensationalized.
Yeah.
So that needs to be treated with caution. But I also think the whole countercultural movement is definitely part of that. The whole Tolkien mythology and that's expansion through the films of Peter Jackson and so forth. So these are very different things. But the hippie movement, for example, of the 60s was really, all done 50 years earlier, even in California, funnily enough, by
And again, a lot of it was draft dodgers, but not from Vietnam, obviously, but from the First World War. Most of the original sort of hippies were German and Swiss.
Right, yeah.
And seen some amazing photos of a guy, playing a guitar with long hair and a beard, living on an Indian reservation in California. And most people think, oh, if you ask them, when's this photo from, they say 1967, and it's 1917.
Yeah, so, that's right.
So that grew out of the whole Germanic culture, and as I'm sure you're aware, lots of other countercultural movements or alternative movements, whether it's ecology, vegetarianism, nudism, so forth, pretty much all developed in Germany. And a lot of that was to do with, came out of romanticism, going back to nature, escaping from the decadence of the city and the modern lifestyle. So a lot of people were tapping into pagan roots, whether consciously, as in some cases, or unconsciously in others. And I think that's one of the things that Jung said, which is important, is that, just because it's not conscious doesn't mean it's not there. And really, it needs to be made conscious. And again, another commentator on the essay that Jung wrote about Odin has said, in Jung thinks that the individual, if they have some disengaged part of themselves that maybe turn into a neurosis or is suppressed, then it's extremely unhealthy and needs to be reintegrated into the wider person to become holistic. And I think that's true of societies or collective archetypes, because of course Jung believed in a collective unconscious as well as an individual one.
Yeah. So would you say that the West is repressing its sort of Odinic consciousness, or?
Yes, I think in some ways it's coming out consciously, but in a lot of ways it's still fairly unconscious, because to most people it's just why would I be interested in that? That was hundreds, thousands of years ago, whatever.
Yeah.
What's it got to do with me? And if it was any good, why did Christianity take over? But being a bit more serious, you do see the myths and the behaviors coming through in all kinds of ways. As I mentioned, with Tolkien, of course, was very conscious of that. He wasn't a pagan, and there really isn't any religion in Lord of the Rings. But he was a professor of Old English. He worked on the Oxford English Dictionary on B, I think. And, and he was a master of all these languages, and obviously he developed a mythology for England, as he put it, because he felt there really wasn't one there, or hadn't been for so long that it needed rejuvenating. And I think many genres, a lot of the science fantasy draws on pagan imagery and roots, again in a crass way in most cases, but it's not just about quality, it's about quantity. And I think there's some heavy metal, as I mentioned before, is a type of music which again draws on those kind of elements.
Right, absolutely. But you mentioned a lot of people wouldn't really grasp why they should be interested in this subject. So maybe you could explain why people would want to be interested in Odin or in paganism and so on in this day and age, when we can go to Starbucks and watch TV and there's entertainment everywhere. Why would we want to take this subject seriously?
Yeah, I suppose it depends on people's perception of the world. If they think the past has any importance, I know our whole society is predicated on the concept of endless progress, and really that progress is not evident except in certain spheres like technology. It's blatantly obvious that technology has progressed, but I'm not sure much else has, and certainly many things don't change for the better at all. And obviously in some cases, you mentioned television, there's some pretty bad stuff on there that would never
probably the crassest era in the whole of the history of humanity. So if you think the past is important, I think most people think their own personal past is important. Like they think about their the times they've spent in the past and how it's led them to where they are and so on.
Yeah.
So why not look at that in a broader sense in terms of your society, your culture, and your roots? Because in a way, it's who you are. It's not like shopping in a New Age supermarket for a religion or a spiritual path. It's really just looking inside and realizing you're part of an ancestry which goes back a long way, and that's why it's relevant, because it's actually part of you.
Right. Yeah. Well, in what ways might it affect us if somebody were to become interested in it, whether they had an interest in spirituality before or not? What kind of changes do you think might occur in them?
Well, a deeper sense of authenticity, I think, because it's extremely difficult to adopt, another religion. Obviously Christianity and Islam and Buddhism are faiths, for everybody, in the sense they're universal religions. But I think that you can't just play it being other people. And I think one of your guests recently wrote a very perceptive book, Aki Kelleberg, and he said that he went to India to find his roots in Europe. So I hear he's writing another book about those European adventures, which should be even more interesting than his first book.
Yeah.
So, I think it's the question of authenticity is, you can't play dress up and, necessarily take on, a name that isn't your own from a different culture and really get to the deepest core of that. I mean, you can certainly learn things. I'm not being against that at all. But I think in the end, you are what you are and where you came from, and that's where you need to look.
Right.
And I think most people see it as a very personal quest. That's part of the individualism of our era, is that people tend to see themselves as separate units. But I don't think that's really real. I think we're part of something bigger, and that's why we need to look into the past to see where we came from.
Yeah. And you mentioned about playing dress up. So what is Odinism today? I mean, how can people express it authentically? Is it wearing velvet robes and running through the woods, or is it something else?
Well, a lot of people do play dress up even when they have found their own roots. They want to be a Viking or something, or there are certain groups that, want to sort of stick their head in the sand and say, Christianity never happened and let's go back to some kind of historical age, whether it's the Viking age or, early Anglo-Saxon Britain or somewhere. Personally, I that's kind of superficial. That's not what it's about. I don't think people need to, take swords everywhere they go and, pretend that some historical era in the past is where they're at, because that's not what it's about. I mean, every era is different, and really you're talking about something that's timeless. So when I say the past is important, I don't mean we should live in the past or, involved in any kind of archaic behavior. That's just not what it's about.
Right.
But people do it, of course.
Yeah. So what are some of the things that people should do you think, to do this authentically?
Well, I think they need to explore the sources. The Norse Eddas. That's where all the the Scandinavian pagan mythology. There's some great stories there. I mean, they're entertaining as well as spiritually enlightening. And there've been quite a few interesting people who've been involved in the revival, who are definitely worth reading. Jung, obviously, Tolkien is sort of part of it, I think. And there's other people that I deal with in the book. Some, people are not so good maybe, but, Guido von List is a very important person. He was the one that sort of revived the idea of the runes as a mystical and magical tradition, I suppose.
Right.
His work's very interesting. So really, there's plenty of modern authors, who've, looked at the sources but added their own insights on top of it, which is, to me, is what it's all about. It's not just, as I said before, it's not about living in the past or thinking, perfection on any kind of horizontal level was ever there in the past. There is no golden age in that sort of crude version of history.
Right.
I mean, it's a state of being in a way. I mean, it's always Kali Yuga in one sense, and it can always be the golden age.
Yeah, so it can always be the Kali Yuga or the Iron Age, but it can also be the Golden Age. So would you say it's a matter of orientating oneself?
Yeah, I think it is definitely. I suppose it's about verticality. Most people think horizontally, and when you're talking about mundane history, that's what you're talking about, the horizontal.
Yeah.
But really, you're talking about states of consciousness, and that's a vertical thing, and you see that in various traditions which have some, deep historical links in the Indo-European world with European paganism. I mean, for example, in Iranian Sufism, they talk about the North in terms of, higher states of consciousness.
Yeah.
There's a kind of mythic geography which is mirrored in the Norse tradition too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, what would you recommend people do in terms of practices or getting in contact with this sort of consciousness? Well,
I think everyone's got to find their own path in the sense of what they like doing or what excites them.
Yeah,
I think there's many ways. The ways that exist in any spiritual tradition, whether it's divination, some kind of physical exercise which involves a spiritual component. For example, obviously examples like yoga and so forth. Or if they're more magically inclined, so there's various ways that people can explore it, and it needn't be, it's not like a kind of magic in the normal sense. It's not, it shouldn't be sort of defiled by New Age occultism, which it often is, of course. I mean, there's some quite perverse movements in it that are basically, trying to create a kind of Germanic pagan sort of Satanism by, using all the enemies of the gods and ancient gods and worshipping them as if that was ever done in the past. Just really, I'm bored with pretending to be a Satanist in the Christian tradition. Can't we do a pagan version of it? So it's, there's a lot of ridiculous stuff going on. But that's always going to happen.
Yeah.
I think, as I say, there's various ways of doing it without it just becoming a sort of gimmicky thing. Depends what people, appeals to them. There's something there for everyone, I think.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so where can people find out more about you and more about the book? I mean, it's on Amazon, obviously, but...
Yeah, well, I've got a Facebook page. I've got some details of my various books on there. I'm just sort of working on my website now, so that should be up and running fairly soon, but isn't right now. It's just needs some tweaking and whatever. But like my Facebook page has got some details about me, and I've also done some historical documentaries and. So you can Google me and you'll probably maybe find some stuff on YouTube.
Okay, great. Well, thanks very much.
Okay, you're welcome.